Now, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Jews called it the Torah. In the Catholic Christian Bible, we call it the Pentateuch, but you know them: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And from those 5 books, we get all the laws that were to govern God's chosen people. And why did he give them laws? Because he was making a covenant with them. And that was like a marriage, where even though God created all the people on the earth, he said, Israel, you're the chosen ones. I am going to show you preference above and beyond all the other nations of the world. But where there is a marriage, there will be vows, just like are exchanged right here on this spot when brides and grooms pledge themselves in a covenant that God creates with them. They pledge they will do certain things. They won't do certain other things. With relationships come rules. Anyone who thinks there aren't rules in relationships probably was never in one. Because if we can't agree how to stay in our lane, then someone's going to veer off course, others are going to crash. God gave those laws to Israel not to take away their freedom, but to protect and to preserve their freedom and their life, and to keep them on the straight and narrow path that would lead them to the promised land. The book of Deuteronomy, the last of those 5 books that we hear from today in the first reading, is really a series of speeches that Moses gave to 1 million Hebrews in the desert of sin before they crossed the Jordan to enter the promised land. He knew that they were going to finish the journey without him, and he had known that for the better part of 40 years. And he wanted them to trust in the Lord and keep God's commands so they would have long life in the land they were about to occupy. And so in 34 chapters of Deuteronomy, Moses is giving them a lot of advice. Chief among them, learn from my mistakes. As soon as they got across the Red Sea and into that desert, the complaints started coming in. Those 1 million people that crossed that sea said to Moses, it was better off that we would have stayed in Egypt. Maybe we weren't free, but we had beds to sleep in and food to eat. But there in that desert sun, they began to complain about the heat of the day, the cold of night. They had nothing to eat, nothing to drink. That should have been their lesson. God got you out of your enslavement. He kept you dry across the Red Sea. He didn't bring you out here to die. He will make sure your needs are met. And God met those needs in a wonderful way, with quail, with manna from heaven, and with water from the rock. But it was in chapter 20 of the book of Numbers where God told Moses, take Aaron's staff, strike the rock once, and enough water will come forth from that one boulder that the thirst of 1,000 people will be satiated. Moses took Aaron's staff, and he struck the rock once, and then he struck the rock twice. That was the offense. And the punishment was, Moses, because I told you to strike it once and you struck it twice, you will lead these people wandering in the wilderness of the desert for 40 years. You will get this close to the end of your journey. You'll be able to see the promised land. You'll be able to smell its air. You won't enter into it. That seems a little harsh as far as we are concerned. But Moses was chosen by God to be a patriarch, a father to his people, a leader. But if Moses wasn't good at following God, he wasn't going to be good at leading other people to him. When Moses struck that rock a second time, it was as if Moses thought that Moses, was going to bring forth water from the rock. In that moment, Moses wasn't letting God be God. He was trying to seize control, and he was going to pay for it. So now it's 40 years later. He's 120 years old. They're reaching the base of Mount Nebo. He's going to go up there and die, and he will never come down. He'll be buried and left behind as they cross the Jordan under Joshua's leadership, Moses' successor, and take possession of the land. Moses wants to teach them how to get there and how to stay there. And God has made it very clear. He doesn't just show us the way, he shows us how. Keep the commands. Don't add to them. Don't subtract from them. We'll see about adding to. That will apply to the gospel today. What about subtracting from? That seems to be the context of the world in which we live today. Subtracting from God's law, deciding which ones matter and which don't, which ones I will obey and which ones I won't, because in that moment we're striking the rock a second time. I can do better than God. I know better than God. I will be God. I will be the captain of my own ship, even if I sail it to the bottom of the sea. And this is the time in history at which people decide, I will obey the things that are easy for me. I will obey the teachings that are agreeable to me. And the others, well, rules for thee, but not for me. Moses said, no. If you want to have long life in the land, if you want to enter the promised land, don't add anything. Don't take anything away. And that was echoed throughout Moses' life and death. It was echoed by Jesus in the 1,000 days of his ministry, and even in the very last page of your Bible. If you were to open up the end of your Bible, start from the back, the last chapter of the book of Revelation, chapter 22, St. John, the beloved disciple, would say this at the very end of the Bible, echoing what Moses told the Israelites today. Listen to this. I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to that person the plagues described in this book. If anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away that person's share, which are described in this book. Our share of what? His inheritance, the chance to one day cash in our chips and exchange our cross for the crown of righteousness, to find happiness in the only place where it can be found, with God in heaven. Moses and the last page of the Bible are pretty clear. Walk that straight and narrow path. God has shown us the way. He's also shown us how. Keep those commands. Don't add to them. Don't subtract from them. It is not a menu. It's going to be all or nothing. So now we've talked about subtracting from. What about adding to? That's the problem that Jesus has with the Gospels. Remember, we started with 5 books of the Bible, from which they pulled out 613 laws that govern God's people. They were called the 613 laws of ritual purity. How you are to keep yourself, how are you to keep your things, always with an emphasis on cleanliness, being next to godliness. That was God's law. And that was more than enough. 613, that's a tall order for anybody. But over the centuries between Moses and Jesus, and there's over 1,000 years between them, people among the elite of Jewish faith began to add to those laws, doing exactly what Moses told them not to do. So whereas the laws came from the Torah, the Pharisees introduced the Talmud, the dreaded commentary on the law. And by the time Jesus was having this discussion in the 7th chapter of Mark, just after the loaves and fishes that we've heard about for the last 5 weeks, there were 6,000 pages in that commentary. And those Pharisees were making a list and checking it twice, but they never found anybody nice. Everybody was naughty. Everybody was offensive. That law given by God was given as a means by which to keep right relationship with God and with one's fellow man, or to restore it where it was broken. But in the hands of those Pharisees, where they took and exploited the 613 laws into 6,000 pages of commentary that no one could know or be responsible for, it wasn't for you, it was against you. Instead of an instrument of love, the Pharisees took God's law and turned it into a weapon, a wedge that would make people feel far from God, far from each other, unlovable, untouchable, unclean, unworthy. That's what Jesus was calling out. The word Pharisee in Hebrew means the separated ones. They loved it that way. They were practicing social distancing long before COVID because they thought there's God, and then there's the Pharisees just beneath him, and then there's everybody else. And the law made them feel so incredibly righteous, making themselves feel bigger by making other people feel small, like they counted for nothing. And that is why Jesus calls those separated ones hypocrites, because no matter how clean they kept their cup, their kettle, their jug, or their bed, if they had filth in their mind or their heart, the sin is coming out. It's not contamination that's coming in. Let's take just one example of the means by which the separated ones, the Pharisees, exploited the law. The 3rd commandment from the 20th chapter of Exodus. God said, keep holy the Sabbath day. That could be broadly interpreted by different people in different ways. But the Pharisees in that Talmud, the 6,000 pages of commentary, they decided to extrapolate on that third commandment. Remember how many times Jesus and his apostles got in trouble because they were doing quote-unquote work on the Sabbath day? Well, in the hands of Pharisees, the third commandment, keep holy the Sabbath day, became a list of 39 categories of things that you would be found unclean if you were found out doing them on the Sabbath day. Let's just go down the list. You don't want to be found guilty of these things. On the Sabbath, the Pharisees said you could do no carrying, burning, extinguishing, finishing, writing, erasing, cooking, washing, sewing, tearing, knotting, untying, shaping, plowing, planting, reaping, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, selecting, sifting, grinding, kneading, combing, spinning, dyeing, chain stitching, warping, weaving, unraveling, building, demolishing, trapping, shearing, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, smoothing, marking. Perhaps it would be better to stay in bed on the Sabbath day, because in the eyes of the Pharisee, you really could do nothing. Maybe you could breathe. Maybe that wouldn't be a sin. And Jesus, that's why he calls them hypocrites, because they added to God's law. He said, you're clinging to human traditions, which will save no one and most likely damn everyone, unless you're lucky enough to be one of those separated ones, a Pharisee. This is why the Pharisees thought Jesus was an outlaw to the outcast, because he seemed to break all of the laws that they had added. He was after keeping God's law pure. He said elsewhere, I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. What was he going to fill it with? What was so lacking in the Pharisees' additions to that law? Love. That's all that was missing from the Pharisees' Talmud, their commentaries on the law, the way they kept adding to God's commands. There was no love of God there, and there certainly was no love of their fellow man. They only loved themselves and the laws that made them feel better than everyone else. How many times do we tell someone something's wrong, not because we think it's going to do them harm, but because we want to be right, and we'd like them to know that we're right and that they're not? James tells us in the second reading today, be doers of the word, not hearers only. Yes, the law has been given to us. Jesus is the way. God has shown us the way, and he's also shown us how to keep his commands, apply them with love, add nothing to them, subtract nothing from them, and we'll find what we're looking for. Let us stand and profess our faith. I believe